As insurgency takes root in several African nations, can the continent truly defend itself? Despite the looming danger, African nations are taking action. Burkina Faso is even developing drones to fight back. But is this fight being waged without Western intervention? And can Africa do it alone? Let's find out. Burkina Faso is making achievements to end insurgency in Africa, and it is done without Western aid. But what's the current condition in Africa? When we talk about insurgency in Africa today, we aren't dealing with isolated incidents or fringe groups causing minor unrest. What we're witnessing is the evolution of insurgent networks into highly organized, dangerous forces that not only destabilize regions, but are now interwoven with global terrorism. Insurgency on the continent has deep roots, particularly in areas like the Sahel, a vast stretch of land that runs across West and Central Africa, where insurgent groups have found sanctuary amidst weak governance, porous borders, and underdeveloped infrastructure. A large part of the problem can be traced back to the historical and geographical realities of Africa. The borders we know today were drawn up by European colonial powers in the late 19th century without any consideration for the ethnic, cultural, or religious groups that populated the continent. This resulted in nations that were fractured from the start, filled with internal divisions that have only deepened over time. Nigeria, for example, is one of Africa's most powerful countries, yet its northern region remains a hotbed for insurgent groups. The northern half of Nigeria, predominantly Muslim and economically neglected, has long been fertile ground for insurgent ideologies to take root. What's different about insurgency in Africa compared to other parts of the world, like the Middle East or Southeast Asia, is how these groups have adapted to the continent's unique terrain and socio-political environment. The Sahel, for instance, with its unforgiving climate and vast, sparsely populated stretches, offers perfect conditions for insurgent groups to hide, regroup, and move across borders with little interference. Governments often have minimal presence in these remote areas, leaving the door wide open for insurgent groups to operate freely. The economic backdrop of the Sahel cannot be ignored either. This is one of the poorest regions in the world, where poverty, unemployment, and lack of education create a sense of hopelessness for millions of young people. Insurgent groups in Mali tap into these grievances by offering a perverse form of salvation. For many young men, joining an insurgent group is not driven by religious fervor, but by the promise of food, money, and a sense of purpose. In this sense, insurgency in Africa isn't just a security issue, it's an economic one. But here's where things get even more complicated: the role of foreign powers. France, for example, has had a military presence in the Sahel for years under its Operation Barkhane, which aimed to curb the spread of jihadist groups in the region. While the French government intended to stabilize the region, the presence of foreign troops has often stirred resentment among local populations. Instead of viewing foreign intervention as a stabilizing force, many Africans see it as a continuation of colonial control. Insurgent groups have been quick to exploit this sentiment, positioning themselves as defenders of African sovereignty against Western imperialism. It's a powerful narrative that has resonated with many disillusioned communities. What's worse, Western military interventions have often failed to address the underlying causes of insurgency: poverty, corruption, and the disenfranchisement of certain groups. Instead, they've focused on military solutions, which may temporarily suppress insurgent groups, but do little to change the conditions that allowed those groups to rise in the first place. This is a key reason why insurgent movements continue to gain strength despite years of foreign intervention. In the face of this growing crisis, African nations are increasingly questioning whether Western involvement is helping, or if it's time for the continent to take matters into its own hands. Countries like Mali and Burkina Faso have already made moves to reduce their reliance on foreign powers, seeking homegrown solutions to combat insurgency. But the road ahead is long and difficult. Can African unity end insurgency in the continent? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The concept of African unity is a powerful one, evoking images of Pan-Africanism, solidarity, and collective strength. It's an idea that has existed since the days of liberation movements, as African nations sought to throw off the shackles of colonialism and chart their path. But when it comes to insurgency, Can unity be the answer? Can African nations, so diverse and often divided by borders and internal conflicts, truly come together to tackle one of the continent's greatest threats? First, it's important to understand what we mean by unity. In the context of combating insurgency, unity isn't just about political solidarity or military alliances. It's about a shared vision for the future, where African nations cooperate not just out of necessity, but because they believe in a common cause. This type of unity would require African countries to not only pool their resources, but also align their strategies, share intelligence, and create a framework for collective security. It's a tall order, especially when you consider the fractured state of many African nations today. Take, for instance, the ongoing conflict in the Sahel. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, all plagued by insurgent violence, have formed the Alliance of Sahel States (AES) as a way to combat these threats collectively. This is a promising development, signaling that African nations are beginning to take ownership of their security issues, rather than relying solely on foreign powers. The AES aims to create a coordinated military response to insurgent groups with the hope that a unified front will be more effective than fragmented national efforts. However, unity on the continent faces several obstacles. For one, the borders created by colonial powers have left many African nations with deep internal divisions. These borders often cut across ethnic and tribal lines, creating nations where unity is difficult to achieve even at a national level. Nigeria, for example, is home to more than 250 ethnic groups, many of which have long-standing grievances against the central government. In such a context, achieving continental unity seems like an impossible task. But the challenges don't stop at internal divisions. African unity must also contend with the legacy of foreign interference. For decades, African nations have relied on foreign military aid and intervention to address their security issues, particularly from Western countries like France and the United States. This is where the potential for African unity becomes both a challenge and an opportunity. If African nations can band together, not just militarily but also politically and economically, they may be able to break free from the cycle of dependency on foreign powers. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area (AFCFTA), which aims to create a single market for goods and services across Africa, are a step in the right direction. By boosting intra-African trade and economic cooperation, the continent could reduce its reliance on foreign aid and create the kind of economic growth that addresses some of the root causes of insurgency: poverty, unemployment, and inequality. But economic cooperation alone won't be enough. African unity must also focus on improving governance and addressing the socio-political factors that drive insurgency. In many parts of Africa, weak institutions, corruption, and lack of accountability have created a vacuum that insurgent groups are more than happy to fill. If African nations are serious about ending the insurgency, they will need to invest in building strong, transparent institutions that can provide the services and security that their citizens need. Ultimately, the question of whether African unity can end insurgency comes down to whether the continent's leaders are willing to make the difficult choices necessary for real change. Unity won't come easily, and it won't come quickly. But if African nations can find a way to put aside their differences, work together, and take ownership of their future, they might just be able to create a new paradigm for security and development on the continent. Now, the question arises: if Africa unites to combat insurgency, can it do so without the help of Western nations? And perhaps more importantly, should it? To answer these questions, we need to take a hard look at the complex dynamics of Africa's relationship with the West and the possibilities for a future that doesn't rely on foreign assistance. For a long time, Western nations have been deeply involved in African affairs. France, for example, has maintained a strong military presence in its former colonies in West Africa. Through operations like Serval and Barkhane, the French military has been a key player in the fight against insurgency in the Sahel, conducting counterinsurgency operations and training African forces. Meanwhile, the United States has provided significant financial and logistical support through initiatives like Trans-Sahara Counterinsurgency Partnership (TSCTP). These efforts have undoubtedly played a role in containing the spread of insurgent groups. However, this reliance on Western intervention comes with a host of problems. In recent years, some African nations have begun to push back against this dynamic, seeking to reduce their dependence on Western nations and explore alternative alliances. Countries like Burkina Faso and Mali, for example, have taken steps to distance themselves from France, even going so far as to expel French troops and withdraw from regional defense agreements like the G5 Sahel Joint Force. These moves reflect a growing desire among African nations to assert their independence and take control of their security affairs. But can Africa truly survive without Western nations? On one hand, Africa has the potential to stand on its own. The continent is rich in natural resources, with vast reserves of minerals, oil, and gas that could fuel economic growth. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area (AFCFTA) are already paving the way for greater economic cooperation among African nations, reducing the need for external trade partners. Additionally, Africa's young and growing population presents a demographic advantage that, if harnessed properly, could drive innovation and development across the continent. On the other hand, the transition away from Western dependence will not be easy. Many African economies are still heavily reliant on Western aid and investment, particularly in sectors like infrastructure, health, and education. Breaking free from this reliance will require significant investment in domestic industries and institutions, as well as a shift in the political mindset that has long favored foreign aid over self-reliance. Moreover, Africa's security infrastructure is still in its infancy. While countries like Burkina Faso and Mali have shown that they are willing to go it alone, the reality is that many African nations still lack the military capacity to effectively combat well-armed and well-funded insurgent groups without outside assistance. This is where alternative partnerships come into play. African nations are increasingly looking to countries like China and Russia for support, both militarily and economically. Russia, through its private military contractors like the Wagner Group, has become a key player in the Sahel, offering military assistance without the political strings that often come with Western aid. China, meanwhile, has been heavily involved in infrastructure projects across Africa through its Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), providing loans and investments that have helped build roads, railways, and energy projects. However, these new alliances are not without risks. China's investments, for example, have raised concerns about debt traps, with countries like Zambia struggling to repay loans and fearing loss of control over key national assets. Russia's involvement in Africa, too, has come under scrutiny, particularly in light of reports of human rights abuses committed by Russian mercenaries in conflict zones. As African nations navigate these new partnerships, the challenge will be to ensure that they do not simply replace one form of dependency with another. In the end, whether Africa can survive without Western nations depends on the choices its leaders make. If they can build strong, self-sufficient economies, invest in local industries, and develop robust security infrastructures, there is no reason why Africa cannot chart its course. The path to independence is long and fraught with challenges, but it is not impossible. The key will be balancing the need for external partnerships with the desire for self-reliance, ensuring that Africa's future is shaped by Africans, for Africans.
The ruling military authorities in Burkina Faso have declared a general mobilization to fight terrorism.
Burkina Faso has emerged as one of the key battlegrounds in Africa's fight against insurgency, particularly in the Sahel region, where jihadist groups have taken advantage of weak governance and porous borders to establish a foothold. The country, under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traore, has implemented a bold and multifaceted strategy to combat these insurgent forces, incorporating both military innovation and community-based initiatives. One of the most significant developments in Burkina Faso's fight against insurgency is its use of drone warfare, a cutting-edge tactic that is changing the landscape of counterinsurgency in the region. Drone warfare has become an increasingly important tool in Burkina Faso's arsenal. The country has recognized that the traditional methods of ground-based counterinsurgency operations are often ineffective in the vast and difficult terrain of the Sahel. Insurgents have perfected the art of guerrilla warfare, using the region's arid deserts and dense forests to their advantage. In response, Burkina Faso has turned to drones to provide real-time intelligence, conduct surveillance, and carry out precision strikes on insurgent targets. The use of drones has allowed Burkina Faso to strike at the heart of insurgent strongholds without putting its soldiers at risk. In March 2024, for instance, Burkina Faso conducted a highly successful drone strike in Mali, targeting a key ISGS commander. This operation not only disrupted the leadership of the group, but also demonstrated the potential of drones to deliver decisive blows against insurgent networks. By reducing the need for large-scale ground operations, drones have also helped minimize civilian casualties, which is crucial in maintaining public support for counterinsurgency efforts. However, drone warfare is not without its challenges. For one, the technology is expensive to maintain, and Burkina Faso relies on external partners for the procurement and maintenance of its drones. This raises questions about the sustainability of the strategy in the long term, especially as the country seeks to reduce its reliance on foreign military aid. Additionally, the use of drones in warfare raises ethical concerns, particularly when it comes to the risk of civilian casualties. While drones offer precision, they are not infallible, and mistakes can have devastating consequences. A single miscalculation could lead to the death of innocent civilians, which in turn could fuel further insurgent recruitment and deepen the cycle of violence. But Burkina Faso's approach to fighting insurgency goes beyond military tactics. Recognizing that insurgency is not just a security issue but also a socio-political one, the government has implemented a strategy that includes community engagement and local defense initiatives. One of the key components of this strategy is the establishment of the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDP, a network of local militias made up of volunteers from rural communities. These militias are trained and armed by the government to defend their communities against insurgent attacks. The VDP program is based on the understanding that local communities are often the first line of defense against insurgency. By involving them directly in the fight, the government hopes to create a sense of ownership and responsibility among local populations, reducing the likelihood that they will be swayed by insurgent ideologies. In many cases, these militias have successfully repelled attacks on their villages, demonstrating the value of community-based defense initiatives. Burkina Faso's approach to combating insurgency offers valuable lessons for other African nations grappling with similar challenges. The use of drones, in particular, highlights the potential of technology to revolutionize counterinsurgency operations, while the emphasis on community engagement underscores the importance of addressing the socio-political roots of insurgency. At the same time, Burkina Faso's experience also serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that no strategy is without its pitfalls. As Burkina Faso continues to refine its approach, the country is setting a precedent for how African nations can combat insurgency in the 21st century. By combining military innovation with grassroots initiatives, Burkina Faso is showing that the fight against insurgency requires not just force, but also a deep understanding of the complex dynamics that drive conflict. In the end, the success of Burkina Faso's strategy will depend not just on its ability to defeat insurgent groups on the battlefield, but also on its capacity to build a more stable, inclusive, and resilient society. Do you think that with the steps Africa as a whole and Burkina Faso are taking, insurgency will soon end? Do you see Africa as violence-free? Let us know in the comments section. Are junta leaders doing the impossible? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.